I have done, youth work kind of off and on throughout my life. But I do feel like a lot of what we do as a ministry at the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, even though we're kind of primarily focused on Christian leaders, a lot of our Christian leaders are working with youth. So I feel like having like that Gen Z context in the back of my mind, that's just always in the back of my mind with everything with everything I'm doing in this conversation. Really, I didn't think I would kind of that would be a huge focus, but it has become that. So, man, when it comes to questions around faith, sexuality, and gender, LGBTQ related questions, I mean, our youth, without even knowing your specific context, I feel like I can speak generally about any youth context living in North America. And yeah, this conversation is, as you know, I mean, hopefully I won't preach too much to the choir, but this conversation has raised some of the most pressing ethical questions facing, I mean, the church as a whole, obviously, but youth in particular, in ways that we have not seen before in society. So there was a recent poll done I think it was last January, at least it was published last January, and this might be an American, like a US based statistic. I can't remember the exact polling data, but it was a Gallup poll, and it surveyed Gen Z and said that 1 out of every 6 Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ, which is, I don't know how much higher that is than the adult population, but I mean, it's at least 4 or 5 times higher. So, gone are the days when, in high school or junior high, when you had that kind of 1 or 2, gay kids or whatever, or somebody you thought was probably gay. And that was my context, back in the 80s and 90s, it was like, oh yeah, there was that one kid, like, yeah, pretty sure he might be gay. Now it's like, the percentages are much, much, much higher. There was another study done. This one blew my mind a bit. It was done by the Barna Group, and it said that 39% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ, and 30% of Christians. So 1 out of every 3 Christian Gen Z would identify as LGBTQ. Some contexts I go into, and that sounds about right. When I talk to youth leaders, they're like, oh yeah, half my group identifies as bisexual or non-binary or something, other contexts, that percentage might be a bit higher, but yeah, even if it's oh, smile and nod, everybody. You stop. Big time out. Can you hear me? How much did you miss? Our connection.
There we go.
All right.
That's better. Sorry about that, Preston.
No, you're fine. Can you tell me where I got cut off? 39%. 39%. Okay, good. Okay. So yeah, so in certain contexts, that 39%, and again 30% of Christians is really the one that I'm interested in both statistics. I want to see where society is going, but I want to know like what's going on in the church primarily. So yeah, I mean, these percentages are so much higher than anything we've seen before in society as a whole when it comes to issues of LGBTQ related issues. Now, I want to be really clear that let me just throw it out as a possibility. We need to distinguish between an identity and an experience. Now, I don't want to say that's all there. We should always distinguish between an identity and experience. But what I mean is, just because, a 12-year-old girl says she's bisexual, what does that mean? All you know is that she just said she's bisexual. Like that, we don't know if that is actually, if at 28 she'll still experience attractions to both sexes in the same way. It does seem pretty clear that especially teenagers, and this is true of any generation, are grasping for meaning, or grasping for a term to to name their experience. And sometimes identities can be a way of getting into a group. And we've seen this in several other studies where there does seem to be some level of social influence, not necessarily in shaping someone's actual sexual attraction, but in encouraging somebody to grab hold of a certain identity. So, and we got to be really careful here. Because you could hear me even my voice hesitating a little bit. I don't want to give the impression that just because somebody comes out as bisexual, that doesn't mean that they're not actually experiencing that. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Like that. Sometimes kids, especially kids trying to figure out who they are, aren't even sure what it can't even differentiate between an emotional attraction, a physical admiration, a physical what's the word I'm looking for? Like a desire to want somebody else's body, like maybe like like an emotional jealousy, an emotional attraction. Some girls are like, I like hanging out with girls more than guys. Guys are jerks. And then in today's society, sometimes they're being trained to interpret everything through a sexual lens, so that if they give another girl a hug, and there's any kind of emotional flare because maybe they felt another person's body, which can mean many different things, they're told, oh, you're probably bisexual because you're attracted to guys, and now you had this emotional spark because you gave a girl a hug, or you notice another 15-year-old's body that you think is better than yours, and you like wish you had that kind of body, and oh, that maybe I'm bisexual. So all that to say, there's a lot of really, really confusing messages in our culture today that I think is playing some role in the high percentages of identities of people grabbing, searching for an identity to try to name an experience they're having. So when we say, almost 40% of Gen Z might be identifying as LGBTQ, I don't think we should interpret that as necessarily like almost half of the Gen Z population is attracted to the same sex, will be in a same-sex relationship, or is trans, or will end up transitioning. But this should tell us that, silence is not an option. Like we, and I don't even, even if a school is very conservative, very Christian, like we cannot pretend like this conversation is simply on the fringe out there somewhere, or, oh, we don't have this here. Like silence is not an option. We have to absolutely, as leaders, as teachers, we have to gain a lot of knowledge and education when it comes to this conversation. And I think we need to be having good, healthy, God-honoring, grace-filled, truth-filled conversations with our students about these topics. There has been a rise, and I've kind of hinted at it already, in what I call in-between identities. So it would be way more likely for somebody to identify as, say, bisexual than lesbian. I would love to. I'm really looking forward to hearing from your specific context, but I would love to know if that is generally true in your context, because in many other contexts, that's what we're seeing. Like it's actually pretty rare for a teenager to identify as a lesbian. Lesbian sounds like a very kind of older term. Some say it just sounds kind of really kind of porno, so there's other in-between categories like bisexual, or when it comes to gender, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid. And even in some contexts, it would be more likely for somebody to identify as non-binary than even transgender, even though transgender can be kind of a broad umbrella term. In the United Kingdom, there's been a 5,000% increase among teenage females going to gender clinics because they're experiencing some kind of incongruence or dislike with their biological sex. In the last 10 years, about a 5,000% increase, which is astronomical. And it's raised a question, again, going back to our social influence possibility. It's raised a question: is there something in today's society that is influencing, especially teenage girls, to not like or have some kind of lack of resonance with their biological sex. We already know that teenagers, especially teenage females, are more prone to have body image issues, for lack of better terms. And so biological sex is obviously within that category. It's part of your body. It's, it's a body, an embodied category. And so is there something in the air, so to speak, in certain contexts, certain cultures, that is influencing teenagers, especially females, to question their biological sex? Which, that's an interesting conversation. I do think the evidence is there, that society is playing a role. We are seeing a lot of common patterns among teenagers that identify as under the trans umbrella, but typically non-binary or gender fluid, or gender queer. We're seeing that they are typically heavily influenced by online communities. Oftentimes, being non-binary or coming out as non-binary gains social status rather than the opposite. They don't lose social status by coming out; they gain social status. So that anytime an identity helps you to gain social status or gain access to a new kind of community or friendship group, that you always have to raise a question like, okay, well, is there some kind of social influence there? Because if they would lose social status, that would maybe validate the experience a little more, that this is coming from a genuine, maybe a place of an experience that somebody's willing to identify as, even if it goes against kind of their social environment. But if it gains social status, then you have to at least ask a question: is there some motivation there to grab hold of an alternative identity? When it comes to, and we could talk more, I'm just kind of trying to set the table a bit. So when it comes to the LGBTQ conversation, we have to make a distinction between LGB and T. And with youth, I think the T part of this conversation has become, in most contexts, kind of the front line conversation. In fact, you would probably have kids identifying under the T umbrella at a higher percentage than even the LGB. I think you would have a combo of bisexual and then also maybe an alternative gender identity. That kind of combination is probably the most common. When it comes to identities, and this is something that I have to tell parents a lot, and you might have to navigate this as well. I often tell parents, don't freak out if your kid comes home and tells you that they are non-binary, they are gender fluid, they are bisexual. Like, what is an identity? Like, these identity markers? Well, an identity, if a kid says that they are gender queer, it's the same kid. It's the same kid is standing before you the day before they told you that they were gender queer. Like, nothing has really changed. The only thing that's changed is they have found a term that they are using to try to name some kind of experience they're having. But sometimes, especially when these terms are unfamiliar to parents, or maybe they've heard them before, but they just don't really know what they mean, or maybe they assume they mean something that they don't really mean. I mean, what does non-binary even mean? You never want to interrogate a kid. What is it? What does this mean? But in a loving, listening way, if you have them explain what this identity means, typically they're going to end up saying something like, and they may not even use these terms, but they're going to end up saying something like, well, I don't really resonate with masculinity or femininity, like narrow masculinity or narrow femininity. Like, they will typically point to their likes, their dislikes, their interests. Well, okay, I'm non-binary. Okay, what does that mean? Well, I don't like to wear, I'm a female, or they may not even say I'm a female, but they might say, if it's a female, like, I don't like to wear dresses. I like my hair short. I like to play sports. I mean, in my day, we just say, all right, so like you're kind of tomboyish. It's great. Okay. Guys are kind of into that sometimes, you know, like I don't, like in the past, we had the same, okay. In the past, we had the same experiences, but we didn't have the identity labels that people use to name the experience. The experiences don't seem, in my experience, that the experiences that kids are having don't seem incredibly different. They're wrestling with typically masculine and feminine stereotypes. Well, goodness, most of us are. Like, I had one mom that her son, 17-year-old son, came out to her and said, "Mom, Dad, he's male, biologically male, but said, I'm actually a woman." And the mom just kind of quickly said, "Well, what, honey, why would you say that you're a woman?" He says, "Well, because I like romantic comedies, I like rom-coms, and I like to watch lesbian porn." And that was it. Like, like, what? And then my mom was like so confused, like, you know, what, like, what does that even mean? Like, what is that what it means to be a woman? Like, do all, you know, if a person doesn't like to watch lesbian porn, does that mean, or what about the many guys who like to watch rom-coms, you know, like that, we're all of a sudden using, and again, a teenager's they're typically not going to know how to navigate these kind of categories very well, which is, again, this is the prime opportunity for us to help them in a very loving, listening, accepting way to help them navigate these categories. But what is going on beneath the surface, what it seems to me, is that oftentimes these gender stereotypes are becoming the foundation by which we are defining what it means to be a man or a woman. Again, no kid's going to say that, like, yes, the stereotypes are the foundation, but if you get them talking, I would just encourage you as leaders to kind of just be looking for that. In my experience, that seems to be the majority of cases of what ends up happening, is that their explanation of this experience that they're having, that they're naming with an identity, is often propped up with gender stereotypes, which is a great opportunity for us, both preemptively and reactively. Preemptively meaning, like, before a kid even, you know, comes out as non-binary, even knows that that's a thing, or even wrestles with gender stereotypes. I think we need to build into kids at a young age that being a girl is not one thing. You don't need to be super feminine to be a godly female. You can be an athlete. You can hate pink. You can like action movies. You can enjoy hanging out with boys more than hanging out with girls. Like, these are all things you can do as a girl, as a godly woman of God. Like, you can do this. I think if we lessened, I think this is just my pastoral theory speaking, I think we might avoid some confusion down the road. Is my internet still working? Can I get a nod of a head? I got a little blip that said, okay, we're good. Lastly, and I'll end with this. It's so, I know this has become a cliche, like being a safe person, creating a safe space for kids, you know, and that even that whole idea has been so politicized, you know, it's, at least in America, you know, it's all the quote, you know, Democrats who are all about safe spaces, and the Republicans who are like snowflakes, you know, get out of here, you know, I'll destroy your safe space, you know. But here's the deal. There has been a massive rise in concern for safety in the last 5, 6, 7 years. I don't know if you haven't read the book, The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. I mean, this should be mandatory reading for anybody working with youth today. The Coddling of the American Mind. And what they say in that book, and it's something that a lot of psychologists have noticed, that they just kind of did a great job summarizing it, but that there has been what they would say is the very unhelpful concern for safety. And by safety used to mean like, we need to help kids, we need to protect kids from like physical bullying, you know. But now the concern for safety has translated into even like, we need to protect our kids from hearing ideas that they might disagree with, or hearing ideas that might challenge them. And that's what the whole book, Coddling the American Mind, is like. We're creating a very unhealthy, good motivations. We want to protect our kids and keep them safe, but we're creating an environment where they are not building healthy resilience. There's another scholar, Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility. Our immune systems, as we all have learned, get stronger when they're exposed to germs and stuff. Like, the worst thing you could do for your immune system is keep it completely away from any kind of like germs or whatever. Or your muscles get weak and atrophy if they're not being stressed and challenged. And the human mind is kind of the same way. Like, if all we do is sit in echo chambers and protect ourselves from alternative ideas, we're creating just really fragile kids that aren't going to be able to live in the real world. Anyway, that's kind of a side issue, but regardless of all that, there is just built into the Gen Z psyche, and there's been several studies done on this deep concern for safety. It is what it is. I think the over concern for safety can be very unhealthy, and that's something we can work to address kind of in the long run. However, kids are, especially, the number one thing they're looking for is a safe person. So if they are wrestling with something, if we want to be invited into their life, which hopefully we would want to be, like, we would want them to look at us and say, hey, can you help me wrestle with this? Can you help me walk through what I'm wrestling with? We need to be perceived as a safe person. And what does that look like? I mean, I think you guys would probably be able to answer that even better than I can. For me, at least, I know being a very, very good listener, not an interrogator, just taking a genuine interest in people when they're talking to you. Even body language things like staring at somebody in the eye when they're sharing something deep and intimate can be a huge open door to inviting them in, to letting them invite you into their life. The listening piece is huge. I mean, even if a kid is saying something that sounds so ridiculous, like just being genuinely curious about the humanity of the person sitting in front of you, kids pick up on that so quickly. And so I don't know, there's things like that we can do so that we are perceived as a safe person, not just perceived as a safe, but we are a safe person, so that they can talk to us about what's going on in their life. And then when they perceive us as a safe person they can trust, we can build relational collateral to where if there does come to a place where they might need to be challenged, they will receive it better if it's coming from somebody who they can trust, somebody who has demonstrated that they are a safe person. I've spoken to several like trans people who some have transitioned, some have detransitioned, some never transitioned but still identify as trans, some no longer identify as trans, and they're and this is definitely true in the Canadian and US context, but there is such a rush to transition teenagers, and there is it's scientifically false, but an idea that if a kid comes out as trans, then their two options are they're either going to end up being highly suicidal and probably end up killing themselves, or we need to transition them. That is scientifically inaccurate and naive, and I would say destructive on so many levels, that narrative. But it is what it is. That's how kids are being told to think. Like, if I don't transition, then I'm going to end up killing myself. And if anybody stands in the way of transitioning, they are toxic, they are dangerous, they are violent, because they're basically furthering your suicidality if they even tell you to put the brakes on transitioning. So here's the one exception. The only person that could help them maybe put the brakes on transitioning is somebody who has demonstrated, I am a safe person. I am for you. I'm not just a talking head who's going to tell you the truth, and then leave your life. Like, I am listening to you. I am genuinely concerned with you. Only that kind of person, in my anecdotal experience, talking to many trans people who, think back on their teenage years, that only that kind of person would demonstrate the credibility to maybe speak some, I would say, wisdom in the life of a 14, 15-year-old who is, desperately wanting to transition so that they don't end up killing themselves. All right, I'm going to stop there. There's so much more we can talk about. But yeah, just to reiterate, the gender piece of the LGBTQ has become so huge in almost every context that I'm in. So I would love to know if you have questions or what resonates with you, or if you have any specific scenarios or whatever. Wherever you want to go from here.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the context. We surveyed our staff and we gathered a number of questions, and I generally found kind of two recurring kind of themes. So the first one was integrity to the biblical text, and the second one was responding to students' questions. One of them I think may help to set the stage a little bit there, but again, integrity to the biblical text and responding to student questions. So here's from one of our staff members. What might you suggest for navigating a class discussion regarding the Bible and homosexuality when a student might perhaps misrepresent a text? I wonder if this question is even asking here how to walk the line of textual accuracy without killing the conversation or even the relationship.
Wow, that's a great question. And again, I wish I could survey, like sit in a few of your classrooms for a couple of days so I kind of get the vibe and tone, because yeah, most, in my experience, most students, they are very concerned with being able to love their LGBTQ friend, or if they identify as LGBTQ. And so I don't know, like as a Bible teacher, as somebody like that's primarily what I am. I'm a Bible guy. So I can just go in and just teach the Bible like all day long. Like that's my happy place. With students, if all they hear is, the biblical view on same-sex relationships, again, I think this is kind of a cultural thing. Some of them can interpret that as either you fully affirm same-sex relationships and that's the loving view. If you don't hold to that view, then you're a homophobe, transphobe, you hate gay people, and you're furthering the suicide rate among LGBT people. Like those are the two options that kids have been fed, So I want to provide kind of a much more nuanced position that, that the biblical, that God's design for sexual expression is the most loving thing we can tell people. And I would even frame it in those categories. Like, if there is a creator who has created us, he's obviously created us as sexual beings. He's made this even a pretty big part of our humanity. So I would hope, and I would expect that creator to help guide us in how we should steward our sexual bodies in a way that resonates with God's design, in a way that leads to human flourishing. I think those kind of categories of following God, the creator's design of what does lead to the most human flourishing. Is it simply acting on whatever desires come up in anyone's heart? Like, are our desires a good moral guide for how we should steward our sexual bodies? Let's imagine that world for a second, where everybody simply said, no, whatever desire I have in my heart, that defines what is good. Nobody's going to want to live in that world, for very long. That'd be chaos. So I think simply going to Leviticus and saying God says no to this and yes to this and yes to this and no to that, the kind of moral do's and don'ts that aren't put within a bigger framework of what is the creator's design for sexual flourishing. I think simply going to the do's and don'ts isn't a helpful approach. I think we need to go deeper into, more foundational categories. And also kids are often asking the why question. Why is sex outside of marriage wrong? Why does God say no to same-sex relationships? It's loving, it's consensual. What's wrong with this? So I think being prepared to not just quote the kind of the black and white text on the Bible and say, here's what God says, but actually trying to give some rationale to why God has wired things this way. And again, one more thing. So whenever we're trying to instill a biblical vision in the lives of students, in most contexts, they need to constantly hear, they need to hear the other side. We can't just give them the truth. We need to also talk about grace and how God loves LGBT people, and simply being gay is not something that is going to lead you to hell or something, you know, like it's all, our orientations aren't what condemn us. It's how we steward our orientations. So yeah, I'll stop there because yeah, if there's a follow-up or even a specific scenario or something, or maybe an example or something from your context.
Yeah, I've got a kind of follow-up to that, and then I can open up
Okay.
questions after that as well too. So any insights on how to respond when a high school student then might ask, what's wrong with a monogamous gay relationship? And I might add in that this student might affirm Christian covenantal love with that.
Yeah. I always have to put the brakes on my academic side of me that just wants to respond in a logical way. I think I can almost see that student asking that question. Like I've been asked that so many times, and the kind of person that's asking that needs a certain kind of response. If you just answer the question factually, I think they're not going to be ready to hear that. So I would really be careful with my posture in responding to that question. I would maybe even, before I even get to the actual question, acknowledge that, and I could say this honestly, that man, I know same-sex couples, and man, they're generous, they're forgiving, they're gracious, they're nice people, and some of them love the poor like crazy, and they embody so many Christian values, and so yeah, so whatever I say about the relationship doesn't necessarily mean that I think that these are just rotten, horrible people. You know, I probably wouldn't say it like that, but that I want to communicate that there's kind of two things going on here. There's the people involved in this relationship that could be beautiful, wonderful, amazing people, and then there's the intrinsic nature of that kind of relationship itself. And I almost want to help the student distinguish between those two. I might not believe in that sex outside of marriage is God's design. Okay, so I don't, a boyfriend and a girlfriend living together and sleeping together, like, you know, do I think that is a moral act? Okay, that's one question. The other thing is, what do I think about the people involved in this? I'm like, well, man, I know people that are involved in this relationship, and the people are, some of them are idiots, you know, but some of them are just beautiful, wonderful people, you know, so that I can affirm all that. But if you're asking me about the nature of this relationship, then that's kind of another question. Now we're in the realm of kind of sexual ethics. We're in the realm of what is God's design for marriage. So even the phrase, what's wrong with, you know, a monogamous same-sex relationship, if you want to dissect even that question, monogamous, gamis comes from, well, gammy or whatever, the Greek word for gamos means marriage. So we have to first understand what we even mean when we talk about marriage. Like, what I would even, and you got to do this in not a combative way, but I would almost want the student to, what's your definition? Like, what's your understanding when you say marriage, when you say monogamous, like the marriage piece there, what does marriage even mean? Because there's different definitions of marriage, right? Is marriage a union between consensual adults, a union between two consensual adults? Is it a union between two sexually different consensual adults? So I would want to really spend some time unpacking a Christian or biblical understanding of what marriage even is. That's always where I begin theological conversations, is what is our understanding of marriage? Is sex difference an intrinsic part of what marriage even is? And I mean, I can show from the Bible that seems to be the case, that God has designed marriage not simply as a union between two consensual humans, but that sex difference is an intrinsic part of what it means to form a one flesh gamos, a marriage relationship. That's, I mean, Genesis 2, Matthew 19, many other passages. And then that's been the Christian view for 2,000 years, still is in most parts of the globe. Now there is a more secular view, and that doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, but it does come from more of a secular Western culture that says that marriage is a consensual union between two adults, and I don't know how long the two will be part of that definition, but yeah. So I would start with God's design for what marriage even is. What is marriage for? And then I think that sets the table for why something like a same-sex sexual relationship it doesn't fit the kind of design and purpose of why God created this institution called marriage in the first place. And so now I'm wandering into more of an academic conversation, but again, I can't stress enough that even if my logic is airtight and biblical, it's not going to resonate with the student if they haven't seen my heart, that my theology is not coming from a place of homophobia. It's not coming from a place of all gay people are horrible, bad, and wicked and evil. If I don't set the stage with that tone up front, that's all they're going to hear. Oh, so you really are a homophobe. Okay, thanks. I'm going to change classes now because I don't want to be in your presence, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, questions from our staff members? Feel free to come on up here if you have a question.
Kevin, do you want it related to this, or can we go in a different direction?
You can go a different direction. Yeah.
So Preston, I've got a very different question based on something you said earlier about identity and pornography and trying to wrestle with your body as a teenager.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I have a friend who's worked in a gynecology office for 15 years. And her comment in the last 2 years is the number of girls coming into their office asking for potentially referrals for physical changes in their anatomy based on comments from their boyfriends.
Oh gosh.
Is there any study or links that you know of between pornography and this rise in questioning your sexuality or your body or your identity?
Oh man, you're getting as far as studies off the top of my head, I don't know of any. Anecdotally, there are a lot of specialists asking this question. Clearly there's a rise in pornography and among teenagers. I had one friend, Jay Stringer. I don't know if you know Jay Stringer. He's like a specialist when it comes to like sexual abuse. And he says, never before in history have such young humans been exposed to such traumatic sexual experiences as this generation. Because he would consider viewing porn a form of sexual trauma, especially at a young age. Like the responses from the human body are very similar. And what porn does, it just overloads your brain with all these chemicals being released, and it's very similar, he says, to an actual traumatic sexual experience. So when you have 13, 14, 15-year-old kids watching this, and it's becoming more violent, and it's just it's wreaking havoc on people's sexuality. That's true if you don't watch porn until you're 30 years old, but imagine 12, 13, or the porn industry, their target age is 9 years old. They're trying to get porn in the mind of a 9-year-old. That's their target age. So kids being exposed to this at such an early age, or even if it's not 9, even if it is 15, you have guys watching this and expecting girls to do that. And if girls don't do that, then they'll move on to another girl who will. So then girls start watching and saying, all right, I guess I need to look like that. anecdotally, the question you're asking, and even the answer you're kind of maybe implying that like, could this not be playing a role? Anecdotally, absolutely. I wish and maybe that study does exist. I have not come across something that has done kind of a large scale study on. It's hard too when you're working with teenagers, minors, to even do a study like that. But it absolutely is not helpful. and yeah, I think it is probably confusing people's sexuality and even body image stuff. I mean, yeah, absolutely, it's got to be doing that on some level. How, to what extent, it's hard to say. And with, again, with porn becoming more violent, and even like I try to protect myself from doing research on porn for obvious reasons. But from what I've studied a little bit, not by watching it, but like looking at studies that I don't know I don't know how the study is, but I'm not asking questions about how the study was done, but the blurring of heterosexual and homosexual sex acts, I'm hearing is much blurrier now. So that's, if you have a young teen watching that, of course they're going to adopt a more blurry view of sexuality. Yeah.
Yeah, other staff member questions?
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
In one of your more recent podcasts, titled something to do with why the church needs LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
It really changed my viewpoint about like how the church embraces those people. And I'm wondering, how does that apply to a school like ours? Because I wonder, as a Christian school, we're similar to a church, and how are we showing our LGBTQ students that they're actually, we need them in our community to make it a whole place?
That's a great question. And that, the context of that podcast was a talk I gave to 450 LGBT Christians who hold to a historic sexual ethic. And so the context was, we need LGBT people to come follow Jesus, right? And help us, maybe maybe straight people, have a more holistic vision of what that is to follow Jesus. And the four, just for those who didn't hear that, the 4 points I gave kind of a personal narrative that, being involved in this conversation for the last decade or so, in an effort to help the church become more loving, I have actually learned more about Jesus by hanging out with LGBTQ Christians, again, the majority of whom in my world are following Jesus and following a historic sexual ethic. And the 4 categories, if I can remember, one, man, they taught me about friendship, because I got a lot of friends who are committed to celibacy for theological reasons. And friendship to them isn't icing on the cake. It's not like, oh, I need to go get married and have kids, and then if I have time for friends, then I'll go to find some friends. And that's typically how I was nurtured. The main goal, your relational needs will be met in marriage. Go get married, go get a job, provide for your kids, raise your kids. No one really taught me about friendship. And so my friendship muscles have grown really weak. For my celibate gay Christian friends, they can't live without friends. Friendship is a way, way high value. And so I've learned so much about the spiritual value of cultivating good friendships and becoming like a good friend. So that's something that's a value that I think we absolutely need to learn from and embody. And going to your question, like I think helping our kids, not just, I really want to deconstruct the kind of assumed narrative that, you stay pure while you're single, but singleness is kind of miserable, and then you get married and that's kind of where it's all at. That kind of narrative, I mean, obviously doesn't really resonate with the New Testament. The New Testament doesn't build marriage into the promises of the gospel, so I really want to help our kids have better categories of friendship, singleness, and marriage. And my LGBT friends have super helped me with that. I also have several friends who are gay, married to the opposite sex, and have some of the most meaningful marriages I've ever experienced, because they could never rely on sexual attraction to be the kind of fake foundation for marriage. And us heterosexuals who are married, we learned the hard way, right? We fell in love and all these chemicals are released in our brain for a couple of years, and then we enter into marriage and we're super sexually attracted to our partner. And the first 2 years, it's like amazing, and end up maybe having a couple kids, and then at the 7-year mark, where all the divorces happen, you're kind of like I want to have sex with everybody but you, like, so we've learned a hard way through experience that sexual attraction cannot be the glue, cannot be the thing that defines what a meaningful marriage is. My friends who are gay, married to the opposite sex, they knew from the beginning that sexual attraction couldn't be. So they've taught me so much about marriage. And this goes back to, I guess, my talk. Like the church needs what they're called mixed orientation marriages, right? Like we would benefit so much if a gay person married to the opposite sex were leading our marriage seminars to say, let us tell you about kind of some deeper things of what marriage is for, why God created this thing. Sexual attraction can play a role, nothing wrong with that, but it cannot be the glue that holds a marriage together. Our kids, our students need to hear that message. Like they need to ask deeper questions about what is the calling of marriage. Yeah, I'll stop there because I'm sure there's other questions, but yeah, so I think to summarize, LGBTQ Christians who are following, I would say following Jesus faithfully, following Jesus according to a traditional sexual ethic, they're not just needy, but they're needed. Like I think they bring a perspective on what following Jesus looks like that helps us see some of our blind spots if all we had was nothing but heterosexuals in the church.
I think we got time for one more staff question. All right, yeah, maybe just to kind of bring this together a little bit here, Preston, what would you encourage us with as a Christian learning community that wants to listen to Jesus and maintain integrity to this kind of balance of our personal beliefs and convictions, following after Christ, working in a Christian environment? How do we navigate all those different, seemingly sometimes contradictory, sometimes working together kind of perspectives? What would you encourage us to be thinking about, to be learning, exploring, and how can we do that? What would you encourage us with our journey ahead, maybe even at that individual level, and then of the us working together kind of collective level too, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I hope I don't say like preach to the choir too much or say things that you guys already know or are already doing. So let me just speak generally, and maybe you're already completely doing this. Number one, going back to kind of the statistics and where we are in our cultural moment, silence is not an option. This is not some fringe conversation. I would highly encourage any, and typically I say this to churches, any leadership team, but this would apply to faculty and staff, to invest some time, a good deal of time, to studying, educating yourself as staff, reading books, and having honest discussions even amongst each other. I've seen other Christian schools that I've worked with, Christian high schools, that they get into trouble when staff are kind of like sending mixed messages. There's a school, I was in Colorado, that I was talking with the board, and they said that was kind of their number one problem, is because they weren't having good, open, ongoing conversations as a staff. You had one staff member saying one thing and another saying another, even though they all agreed on the traditional sexual ethic. Like they could all sign their doctrinal statement, and that's a great place. Hopefully we're all on the same page theologically, but even like the terms we're using and our tone and our posture and how we're going about it, like that can look very, very different even within a traditional framework. So I would have specific conversations as a staff, even like the language we should be using, even things like pronouns. Like I'm sure there's probably differences of opinion maybe on whether to use a trans kid's pronouns if they want you to use a different pronoun or name, how to go about that, how to navigate that with the parent. Like there's a lot of real just on the ground pastoral kind of questions that it'd be good for, I think, staff and leaders to just talk openly and even be okay with some differences of opinion, just so we kind of know the general vibe of what students are going to be hearing. So lots of staff kind of behind closed doors kind of conversations, training, reading. And then, I mean, I don't know your curriculum. I don't know if there's space for this, but, and I don't know if you've already been doing it, but I would have ongoing conversations at the student level, a series of chapel messages, maybe open forums or something where you can disciple your students in this conversation. If it's not kind of built into the curriculum, is there something outside the curriculum that you can do? And whenever the most healthy kind of training is one that's done with a lot of thoughtful nuance, grace, and truth. But one also where the audience, in this case, students, can ask questions and not feel threatened to ask a question that might reveal that they're coming from a different place. We can't force feed beliefs. We can't force people to believe certain things. So if students aren't there yet, maybe they're really questioning what the Bible says or don't even agree with it, or they heard somewhere that it's been mistranslated and the word homosexual wasn't even in the Bible, or whatever thing they're reading on the internet. Like give them space to be able to voice that and be able to graciously walk with them through it. Because if we don't allow students to ask hard questions, the questions don't go away. The student will go away and find somebody else to answer their question, which basically means they'll go Google it, and who knows what they're going to find out there. So yeah, providing a safe space for students to be able to ask hard questions and disciple them through that. I think that would be an awesome goal, and not just maybe even twice a year or something, have sexuality forums or whatever. But again, I think that your leadership staff needs to get on similar pages before we start to educate the student. Does that resonate? Have you guys done anything like that? Is that something that would be possible, or what would that look like? Again, I'm speaking theoretically. I don't even know if that can even land in your specific context. But
yeah, thank you. That gives us things to reflect on presently and to start exploring and continuing on in our conversations together. So yeah, we really appreciate you taking time to share with us, encourage and challenge us. And yeah, we're really grateful that the tech worked out and things have come together. So, this has been really rich in terms of conversation. So yeah, big thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.